Good morning. Welcome to Finding Truth and Building Trust, which I hope will help all of us as communications students and professionals to better navigate the challenges of civic and civil discourse and dialogue in a world of elusive facts, political polarization, and disruptive technology. Our key mission today is to explore how we can build trust in a sea of skepticism, deliver our messages ethically and with credibility, and how we can find optimism amid so much turmoil. Thanks for being here. I'm Suki Dardarian, and I'm recently retired editor of the Minnesota Star Tribune and also a member of the advisory board for the Arthur W. Page Center for Integrity and Communication at Penn State. We're going to learn a little more about the center in a moment, but first I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. Jon Iwata is an executive fellow with the Yale School of Management. In a very long career at IBM, he held multiple leadership roles, including senior vice president, chief brand officer, leader of the company's global marketing communication and corporate citizenship organization. And in his retirement, he is also executive chairman of the Data and Trust Alliance, a not-for-profit organization formed by corporate CEOs to develop and adopt responsible data and AI practices. Welcome, Jon.
Thank you,
Suki. Also here today is Vivian Schiller. Vivian is Vice President and Executive Director of Aspen Digital at the Aspen Institute, where she and her colleagues are working to empower policymakers, civic organizations, companies, and media in the service of, I love this, in the service of an informed, just, and equitable world. Vivian has held roles at a host of media organizations, President and CEO of NPR, Global Chair of News at Twitter, General Manager of NewYorkTimes.com, Chief Digital Officer of NBC, and she's also on the Council of Foreign Relations and a Director of the Scott Trust, which owns The Guardian. Thank you for joining us, Vivian. I'm excited to get started, but first let's hear more about the Page Center and we'll get back to the webinar.
The Arthur W. Page Center is a leader in ethics education and research. Everything we do starts with innovative ideas inspired by today's challenges. From those ideas, we build a culture of ethics and responsibility for all communicators. Our primary objective is supporting evidence-based research conducted by scholars from around the world. Page Center grants have funded hundreds of projects on a range of communication topics, including AI, corporate advocacy, misinformation, sustainability, and more. We translate that research into educational opportunities that enhance the spirit of responsible communication. Then we integrate that work into training modules, events, and online opportunities that celebrate, enhance, and instill integrity. From business to education to journalism to public relations, we're all communicators, and communication shapes the world we live in. Join us in building a more truthful and trusted future.
Okay, we are back, and we are so fortunate to have two experts with us here today who've worked at the intersection of communication, technology, journalism, ethics, leadership, stewardship, community. Jon Iwata and Vivian Schiller, thank you so much for being here and offering your insights today. I have a number of questions, and we're looking for a robust conversation. So we will save time at the end of the program for Vivian and Jon to answer questions from the audience. So if you're in the audience and you have a question, feel free to pop into the Q&A module at any time and pop in your question, and we can sort through them here. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available after the session. Okay, so I'll set the stage here a little bit. This is stuff we all know, but just to get us in the mood. Here's the scene. Our country and others are awash in polarization. It's being fueled by what some are calling a cognitive war, with weapons being a fire hose of falsehoods. Our own administration is offering up falsehoods about everything from condoms in Gaza to the cause of the COVID pandemic. Just recently, it eliminated the department assigned to battle misinformation. Meanwhile, freedom of speech is under fire as news organizations are attacked in press conferences, threatened with limited access, or slashed public funding. Universities, law firms, former government officials are all seeing similar treatment. This certainly affects private organizations as well, as government has reversed course away from diversity and inclusion. Corporations are following suit, leaving consumers confused about what brands to trust. Misinformation in social media is going unchecked. AI is giving more opportunity to manipulate facts and identities. Polls show people have lost faith and trust in leaders, media, politicians. We can't even trust who we're getting texts from on our cell phones. Across America, protests and counter protests are showing up on street corners. I'm coming to you from the middle of the country, Minnesota, and in one protest and counter protest in a small town here, a colleague of mine shared a photo that I thought was profound. Amid this sea of protesters and counter protesters, one man stood alone, holding a sign that said simply, "This is bad." So let's start there. Vivian, how bad is it? Is trust and communication broken? What concerns you and the Aspen Institute most, particularly as it pertains to media, social media, and what folks are hearing and sharing out there?
That's a lot. What you just asked. Let me answer your first question first. It's bad. It's really bad. In fact, I appreciate your litany of sort of attacks on information that you just rattled off. You know, honestly, there's more than that. We could go on and on for the rest of the hour just talking about everything that's going on in terms of sort of attacks on what I like to quaintly call evidence-based reality. So it's bad out there. I mean, but just to take a step back, prior to the last 100 days, it's not like everything was nirvana.
Right.
There are a lot of challenges. I'll just keep it really high level and short. We can go deeper into any parts of this that you like. There were a lot of challenges to making sure that people get accurate information and believe accurate information. And this goes back to, I mean, it's a perfect storm of, sort of the collapse of many of the business models that have sustained independent journalism, the rise of platforms, which, I'm speaking very, very high level, which sort of reward sort of outrage and, things that drive emotion rather than analysis, polarization of media and populations around the world, which has led to low trust across media, really sort of hyper-partisan media, both in the United States and around the world. We now have AI amplified misinformation across our channels, and declining press freedom around the world. This is all before we get to January 20th of this year. And then in the last 100 days, as you rattled off a little bit earlier, it has been just an outright assault on truthful information and truth speakers. So I can go much deeper, but I'll pause there since I know we got a lot to talk about.
Okay. Yeah, we're in the Debbie Downer portion of this session.
Yes, we
It's not
are.
all going to be like this, but I think having a reality check here is important. Jon, do you see the same things? You're coming at it from the corporate world, public relations, academia. What do you see? Do you see the same picture that Vivian does?
Yes, I think my connection to this is through the lenses of business leaders, both from the Yale work that we continue to do, which has been based on interviews that we continue to have with CEOs. And we started this back in 2019, 2020. And I think we interviewed more than 180 CEOs so far. And we've seen a significant change in the relationship of business and societal issues from 2019, 2020 were aware of what was happening in the world at that time, not just COVID. And businesses were speaking out and taking positions on a whole range of issues because there were so many issues and they were expected to. And the CEO said we needed to take positions, and you can call it a form of corporate activism. So they were actors beyond the commercial, the conventional commercial interests of the firm. And that's changed significantly. And it is, as Vivian mentioned, it really isn't just because of the new administration. They point to very high profile examples of material impact to businesses. They talk about AB InBev and Bud Light, Disney in Florida, even Target. And those weren't just examples of, social media flare-ups. This had a material effect on businesses, whether it was in sales or legislation. And this has caused them to be much more judicious about contributing to these public conversations. And I think that one thing I would share from the work that we've done at our program at Yale, which is called the Yale Program on Stakeholder Innovation and Management, is a series of field studies. The impact of corporations speaking out on polarizing issues on stakeholders in terms of their views of do you want to buy from this company? Do you want to work for this company? And over the past year, no matter what variable we tested, what issue, from immigration to guns to reproductive issues and so forth, it didn't really matter how the company phrased their position or what rationale they use, like it's core to our values, it's core to our business interests, it's relevant to our stakeholders. That's just why we're taking positions. The conclusion was you get hammered. And one can conclude from that, you just remain silent. However, since the beginning of this year, maybe since December, so we ran a new variation of this, which is don't communicate your positions, communicate your principles. And the results were striking. I mean, double-digit improvements in stakeholder sentiment. Again, behavior, right? I mean, would you work for this company? Would you buy from this company? We want to run much more, many more tests, test other variables here. But I think this reinforces the caution, I think appropriate caution that from a business standpoint, the C-suite is feeling to weigh in on some of these fraught discussions. However, it is some cause of optimism, perhaps, that if your principles, your values, that is positively received when companies say we're doing this action or doing that action based on principles and values. And that's what we're seeing here. I think it relates to our discussion because businesses are contributing to this dialogue. Even corporations produce an enormous amount of content that is on the internet. And I know we're going to talk about AI. Yeah. And if you don't like what's coming out of AI, it has everything to do with what goes into AI. And what's on the World Wide Web isn't just social media chatter. It isn't just conventional news organizations. A lot of that's produced by business.
Well, aren't we, I may be getting ahead of ourselves, but aren't we saying then that it's don't get into the weeds, CEOs. Just speak broadly about the great things that you believe in, and that way you won't get hammered? Or is it, I don't know, I read a quote from Bill George, the former CEO of Medtronic, in an interview in the Star Tribune recently, and he said, I think the first thing that CEOs and any leader of any organization, whether it's Harvard University or the University of Minnesota, need to do is to stay true to their values. Then they need to be clear about their purpose and stay true to that. If they deviate in this time, they'll pay a big price. Does that sync up with what you're saying?
Totally. I mean, listen, one of the, I have to use an air quote here, beneficial or healthy results of this period of blowback is that a lot of these statements that were made by companies weren't backed up by actions, or they weren't really core to their business or to their values. And as soon as there's any kind of pushback or blowback or consequence, you saw a lot of this stop or being walked back. And Bill George is known for authentic leadership. I would extend that to authentic brands. And if you are serious about taking positions on issues related, highly relevant to your business and to your stakeholders and your values, then it will compel you to take action and to make statements. But otherwise, accusations of virtue signaling and purpose washing and so forth, valid.
Can Suki, would you mind if I jump in with a question? Sorry, I don't mean to be taking over your role as moderator, but I'm fascinated by, Jon, by this study, and I'm just wondering, and it makes sense on the surface to say, lead with your values, not, your necessarily your actions. But what have you learned do those values include issues like inclusion, like equity? And are those, if you state those as your values, we look at a little bit of a tale of two cities between Costco and Target, right? So I'm just wondering how in the study you see improved stakeholder approval. Does that mean that the business leaders are walking away from, maybe it was virtue signaling, but we're walking away from issues about inclusion?
I think what we're seeing here, because one has to scratch your head over how can we run so many tests where no matter how you phrased it, what you communicated, the rationale you used, it didn't seem to matter. Or my colleagues call it asymmetry of response. It was always the negative that you got never outweighed the positive you gained from supporters of your position. So how do you square that with these more recent studies that show your communication of principles? One interpretation of that is the prior is you're advocating, you're being an activist, whereas this reiteration of your principles compelling your actions is specific to your business. In other words, we're not saying we stand with these issues or these causes. We're saying this is what is core to our business. This is core to our values. This is how we run our enterprise. And this is why we are doing this or doing that. I don't know if that's true, but it seems to be a credible explanation for the difference.
I wonder, I think about it from a journalist perspective, and you're calling out the fact that consumers or the public might see what this brand is doing as activists. Well, media have to write about these things. They have to report on things that people don't like, and in the process get branded as advocates. I think there are moments in our world where media don't do a great job of helping to articulate that. But Vivian, how do you see the media kind of navigating this a little bit differently from corporations?
Yeah, well, you're raising two really interesting challenges. One has to do with the perception or sort of the manipulation of the perception of the news media. The news media, in a platonic ideal, the news media are covering the most important stories that are relevant to their readers. By definition, that means you're going to read stories that are going to make you angry. You're going to read stories that make you think, heck yeah, that's, I believe that's true, and everything, and everything in between. The problem is that there is quite a large cohort of individuals in this country, including some of them in the highest levels of power, who accuse news organizations when they report something that an individual doesn't like of being sort of, aside from being fake news, whatever even that means, but, advocates or activists or taking a political position when nothing can be further from the truth. The second challenge you raise is another difficult one, which is the news media itself, and how many news organizations are really struggling. We're living in an unprecedented time on so many levels. But I think the news media are just, look, we've gone through a lot of eras in this country, but I think what is unique about this era is a direct assault on many of the levers of democracy. And I think the American news media are used to covering that in countries outside, other countries, but not in our own, and are really struggling to use the same kind of um, journalistic impartiality to report on that in this country that they easily would if it were, a foreign land, and just struggling with how to cover what is happening, and a bit of a fear. I think the first issue we talked about, which is the accusation if you're reporting something I don't agree with, you must be an advocate or an activist or partisan. I think some news organizations and reporters and editors have internalized that and like, oh God, well, we need to make sure we both sides and we balance things that maybe don't have balance. So it's an external pressure and an internal pressure.
Let's stay with that a little bit and let's pick up on that theme that John talked about, authenticity. And I'm shifting a little bit into like, how can we battle this? And I think both in the corporate world and also in the media world, that notion of being transparent and authentic and showing your work and saying how you do things, opening up a little bit more has been helpful. There are all sorts of trusting news and trust projects around the media, coaching news organizations on how to be more engaging and transparent. What do you think of that as an approach to navigate this situation?
Well, transparency has always been a vital hallmark of journalism, which is you say what you know and how you know it. And uh, I mean, or it should have been. It hasn't always been the case. But particularly today, to be very transparent about sourcing, what data you are drawing from, to try to convey, who are you talking to, who are the reporters behind it, et cetera, as a way to convey we didn't pull this out of thin air, or we didn't pull this off of a Google search or a tweet off of X. Um, so that's absolutely important. It's not necessarily something new. That said, and not to continue to be Debbie Downer, there are a lot of studies that show this may or may not be very effective. Some of the organizations that you were mentioning, these sort of trust institutes that are trying to create sort of you know, a sort of an emblem that a news organization can proudly display on their website saying, we have met all these criteria and we've been validated by a third party to show that we're the real deal. I'm very skeptical that has any impact. And more research indicates that a lot of what has been traditional fact checking over the last, 8 or so years, 12 years, is also not very effective. It's just human nature. People don't want to be told that the thing that they want to believe is wrong, and they will reject that. So it's a lot trickier than that. I don't think transparency is absolutely important. I'm all for it. We need to step up, and it's not enough.
Okay. John, thoughts about that?
Sure. Again, from the corporate view, with the technology here, I'm going to go down memory lane a little bit. When I was at IBM in the media relations department, we had colleagues, like 25 or 35, all assigned to beat areas and develop relationships with beat reporters who covered many different aspects of IBM and the technology industry. What we observed is over time, as the internet arrived, is our staff got smaller and smaller. Why? Because we were beginning to outnumber the reporters covering us. And this is simply an observation in hindsight that the way people consumed information and came to believe certain things and act upon them, that the role of traditional media, journalism, began to go like this. And then we saw something which we did not anticipate in 1995 when we first got our first browsers, right? That search and the rise of social media and the algorithms combined created this new reality of how people came to get information and came to believe things and act upon those beliefs. So if I fast forward a bit into AI, it's already the case that it isn't search. It isn't the case that people are looking for links to click on, which is search engine optimization, which has been, if you wanted to be a modern communicator or a modern marketer, but whether you're in a political party or whether you're in a healthcare system, you learn this is how people are getting information. But SEO is already giving way to what some people call generative search optimization. So when we put in a search, we're already getting not a series of links, but we're getting an answer produced by a model. Right. So I know we can work on the echo chamber of social media and all of that, but we have to add to this mix now another driver of perception and shared reality or not, and that is AI itself. And from a standpoint of business, I'll just make it like commercial for a second. Like yesterday, a company would say, we have to figure out how to, whenever people are searching for a product, we need to make sure they find us, right? And that meant a link to a piece of content. Today, and certainly into the future, it's going to be, you need to get our thing into the answer that comes out of that model. Well, and there are many claims out there that there are technologies, tools, and techniques to do that. This is extremely troubling, because if you can get that model to say a brand of a toothpaste, you can get a model to say anything you want.
Right.
Can I just jump in on that?
Yeah.
To say it's even worse than that. Which is the answers that AI tools are beginning to generate in place of links. If it's about anything that's happening in the world, the information that the AI tools are synthesizing and spitting out come from all of the content of the news organizations and the publishers that these AI models have crawled. So that leads to two problems. One, when you synthesize a lot of information across news media, we're all familiar with the fact that AI models hallucinate. Who knows what's going to be spit out and how accurate it is. And also, what used to send you, as Jon would say, to a link to a news organization to read more, you now get that summary extracted from that news organization, but with no link back. So this is also further exacerbating a bad problem with the revenue model for news organizations. I mean, it's a self-defeating system, though, because if news organizations are driven out of business, there's going to be less content for AI models to crawl and provide accurate information. So it's not great.
Okay, so both of you are working on this. Both of you are toiling away with other institutions and entities around the globe. And I want to hear some of the things that you're doing that to give us hope, some strategies and techniques that you're working on. Jon, you've got this organization that's working to do the right thing. Tell us about that and how that's going.
So let me put my Yale hat on first. And I think that the output from all this work that we're doing at our program, based on CEO interviews and case study development, is to develop management practices so that leaders are equipped to create sustainable long-term value by generating or building mutually beneficial relationships with stakeholders. And the basis of that are things like their values, their purpose, and so forth. And I know that sounds really basic, but it is a gap. It is a gap in education, and it's a gap in practice. And I think it relates to our conversation here because of that authenticity point. We want authentic leaders. We want authentic businesses as well. And it has everything to do with the trust. One note on that specific to this discussion is because businesses generate so much content, because those models, yes, they do scrape and crawl news organizations, but they crawl everything that's on the World Wide Web, including, by the way, synthesized data. But businesses are generators of content. And I think this is a role for Page to play here, frankly, Suki, and that is in the same way that Vivian says, there's nothing new about transparency and journalistic standards of so forth. It's not something that has developed and adopted by businesses that are creating content. And if businesses would rally around a set of guidelines and adopt them with teeth in it, I should say, like multi-source verification, like transparency and a commitment to publish corrections and so forth. I know that sounds basic, but it's in their interest if they want their brands and their content to be trusted. And there's just an enormous amount of content that's spewing out of companies today, and it's contributing to this whole reality, good and bad.
As an editor, we would get demands for corrections all the time, but I don't know if IBM got them.
Yeah, we certainly would, and I think that IBM, because of the brand and its history, was one that said we can't put out a press release or a speech or something without it being fact checked. But is that true for every business, or I don't know? Sure. So I think, and then one other thing I'd say. Now I'm going to put my Data and Trust Alliance hat on. This is a 25 mostly major brands like Walmart and Johnson and Johnson and so forth. They came together a few years ago to hammer out and adopt and promote the first data provenance standards. So again, if we want to trust, if we don't like hallucination, So if you think of the model, if you don't, can I trust what's coming out of a model? Is what's going into the model to train it? And I know a lot of the large language models are trained on World Wide Web data, and you say, well, is there a standard to know, like provenance, where the data was collected or synthesized, when and how? No such standards existed, at least not in a cross-industry way. And those standards were now, it took years, but those standards are now in place and just recently have been adopted by a standards body called OASIS to drive adoption. So I think we're working on the input side of this to try to have quality data going into these models so that there's greater trust on the output side of it.
Vivian, thoughts?
Yeah, well, I just want to amplify something that Jon said about, for a period of time, I was also working with large brands on their information processes and strategies. And I have to say, corporations, in my experience, take truth-telling very seriously. Obviously, this is not the case for every business, but when you say, well, I don't know that IBM is held to that same level of fact-checking. In my experience, they take this stuff very, very seriously. I was actually incredibly encouraged in my time working with brands that about the ethical standards for content. So let me just say that. That said, we're also living in an environment where there are a lot of people around us with megaphones who don't hold themselves to that same standards and will freely just deny things that are clearly true. And I worry I more than worry. I mean, that is having an eroding effect. I think that is rippling out to, some bad faith media, bad faith organizations, bad faith companies, and what have you. So that's very troubling. But you wanted me to talk about what we're working on in Signs of Hope, I think, is what the original question was. So let me go there. First of all, let me just say, I actually am a big believer in tech, and I'm very excited about artificial intelligence. I think it has tremendous potential, including to help with solutions on all the things we've been talking about so far in this hour. And we are working on that. We're working with news organizations on ways that they can use AI to amplify and use AI to advance their mission, their public service mission. We also work very closely. One of the most hopeful places and most crucial places when we think about news media is local news. Just like survey after survey shows, people trust the local more than they trust the national. People hate the media, whatever that means, but they trust their local news organization. They hate Congress, but they trust their, congressman or what have you. And so local media, survey after survey shows that communities with robust, independent local news have higher civic engagement, higher levels of voting, less not no, but less polarization. And so even though local news has been decimated because a lot of the newspapers has been bought by hedge funds and gutted and the troubles with the business models, there is more than green shoots. There's a whole new cohort of news organizations that are popping up in communities all over the country that really are they have a different cost basis and a business model. Of course, they need money. Even if you're a not-for-profit, you still need to bring in more money than you're spending, or you go out of business. But they are able to make it work, and they are doing the public service, and they're very visible. These are, people see them because it's true as their neighbors, and they really are engaging in communities. And that gives me, we're doing a lot of work on that. It gives me tremendous hope.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd echo that from my experience here in Minnesota, where you have one of the highest voter turnouts, greatest engagement in philanthropy. We've been able to maintain strong loyalty and support from our consumers, and it's been. I think there is a cycle there where if you're engaged civically, you're going to care more about the media that you consume, and by doing that, it's going to help your community thrive. So I appreciate that. Um, a little bit, let's talk a little bit to some of the students here who are studying either public relations or journalism or advertising, or maybe they're going to go be a spokesperson for an elected official or company. What should they be mindful of? And I'm pointing to the page principles here, and you can go online and look at them. Um, they're broad directional standards for how to approach ethical communication, but like think about them and their role in the world now. And I know, Jon, you're teaching them every day, but what should they know? What would you like them to hear and know as they start out in this world?
Well, I guess I have to start with not to how should you be using these AI tools yourself as you become a professional? And there, I think we have to acknowledge that while there is some concern that people do not trust AI, an equal concern is they trust it too much.
Right.
And they simply go with what comes out of the model. That's true if you do a search, as we discussed earlier. But it also is, write me something. I'm a communicator. I'm a communications professional, or corporate affairs professional. And in the past, you were trained critical thinking, good writing. You were trained all those processes, and all of that. And of course, the fear is now we're just going to abdicate that to the tool. And I think that is a legitimate fear. And part of it isn't that the tool hallucinates. It's, you really are shortchanging yourself on developing muscles as a person, as well as a professional. So we have to reinforce the value of the fundamental skills of curiosity, of learning, of investigation, of sorting, of looking for patterns, of verifying things. And that's true no matter what you're working on. I think that even if you have powerful tools, which I'm a big fan of using, just like, you just got to stay relevant. You got to know what the tools can do and what they can't do. But I'm speaking more about your own skills and the own capabilities you're building in yourself. So I start with that.
Humans matter still.
Judgment matters, curiosity matters, critical thinking matters.
Vivian?
Yeah, boy, I couldn't agree more with that. With your, you're shortchanging yourself, and it's not just a problem to the individual; it's a problem to society, because the way, there's the law of 10,000 hours. I forgot whose notion that was, to get to expertise, and across industries, we risk losing the tier of people who are in entry level positions, which is how they learn. first years in law firms, and how they learn by, doing things again and again and again, how to write a proper brief that you cannot, shortchange that. Yeah, you can get away with it for a little while with AI. Same thing with people going into journalism, or frankly, absolutely any industry. Going into a tech company, now that AI can do sort of basic level coding, well, guess how you become an expert coder? That, you start with basic level coding. So, I mean, it's societally, it's concerning because it has the potential to erode expertise at a time when, frankly, the notion of expertise is under assault.
Yeah, one other thing I'll say about that, because people who are saying, well, it's like the calculator, don't worry if people, the concern is that they won't be able to do arithmetic
Ah,
and so forth. What I would say about that is you can still buy a calculator today. It has, all those amazing scientific functions, all those buttons. I looked it up. You can still buy those, very advanced calculators, but you still have to know like what those buttons are there for,
yeah,
other than, just the numerals to do, division, addition, subtraction. Like what are all those other, functions for? AI is the same way. I'm not a fan of the term prompt engineering, but it's a
yeah,
placeholder term to say it's like me working with that scientific calculator. If all I'm using that powerful tool for is simple arithmetic, it's to me it's the equivalent of these powerful AI models being used for very simplistic things, like just write me that. We tell this to the students at Yale. This is a massive investment in many ways for you to be here. Don't shortchange yourself,
yeah.
because you're just asking this thing to spit out something. And what are you actually learning? Are you really maximizing, even in that regard, are you maximizing your learning about what you should be using the tool to do?
Well, that's a good point. When we talk about it, and we're one of the Star Tribune is one of the number of newsrooms that's getting help in exploring and developing AI for good. And when people ask about it, and some people are worried, oh, it's gonna take my job away. It's no, this is actually going to take the parts of your job away that are super manual, super labor intensive, and don't use your
Exactly.
brain. You want to free your brain up so it can do the journalism things as opposed to the mechanical things of what we do.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm going to give you each a last word at the end, but we have some questions. So I'm just going to fire them at you. Does that work? Okay. For Vivian, based on your history with PBS, do you feel they can survive the efforts to withdraw federal funding and eliminate their nonprofit status? Is that a place for interested companies to step in on behalf of the public interest?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, my history is with NPR, but it's still public media, and both PBS and NPR are being threatened with defunding. So I'll say this. First of all, threats to defund public media have happened every 2 years since public media was established in the 1960s. So on the one hand, this is nothing new. On the other hand, I think the threat is more dire right now than it ever has been before, just because we have an administration that is shown an unprecedented appetite for defunding things, even when it's been defunding programs that have been authorized for funding by Congress. Um, so we'll see. I would take the threats very seriously. I'll just speak about NPR. Can NPR survive the elimination of federal funding? This is where it gets a little bit complicated. NPR, which is the central organization that creates national programming and gives them to the and licenses those to the stations, doesn't get that much money from the federal government. It's completely survivable. It's maybe, you know, 0.5% of NPR's revenue, but the local stations. So local stations are all independent, and depending on where you are in the country, you're going to get your percentage of the amount of the percentage of revenue that is supported by federal funds can be anywhere from like 5% to 60%. And the stations use that money to obviously run their operations and also to pay for national programming. So if it goes away, it will have a significant impact, particularly on small stations. Ironically, particularly in areas in red states less, where in communities where there might be less other forms of local news. It will have a dent on NPR. I don't think NPR would go away. Can companies step in? Hell yeah. I mean, when I was at NPR, I was, we were studying, and had I stayed, I would have hopefully continued the process of extricating public radio from federal funding. I think journalism and government funding do not mix. I have long believed that, long before this current administration, even the first Trump term was in place. I think it's a bad idea. I think public media needs to get away from federal funding, and I think corporate America can play a big role.
John, what do you think about that?
I think corporations always have played a big role in things they believe in, and the things that Vivian said, I think, represents an opportunity for companies to align these kinds of investments and commitments to their values. I think you're going to see that happen. I mean, I'm chairman of a Smithsonian museum, and there's some issues there as well. And Smithsonian relies on federal funding, but it also relies a great deal on donations and support from individuals as well as corporations. And I think everything Vivian said there also applies to institutions like our cultural institutions.
So the question says, yesterday we saw how CEOs of major companies can affect presidential decisions, specifically pulling back on China tariffs. Is that a more effective way for CEOs to have their voices heard? That sort of piggybacks on that last one, but.
It comes back to authenticity and actions more than statements. And are we seeing opportunistic and craven behavior today? Yeah, probably. Were we seeing opportunistic behavior in 2020 when corporations were tweeting, "We stand with hashtag fill in the blank"? Yeah, probably. And are either of those, were we happy when they were just flooding, social with these empty statements? Are we now surprised when a lot of those disappear? And I think, do we assign courage to CEOs and brands to speak out? I don't choose to use that word. I choose that they are being authentic. Mm-hmm. And it may require a measure of courage because you may experience blowback or repercussions. But if it's core to your business and your values, then and the interests of your shareholders, by the way, CEOs will say, "This is what we're going to do." And as the comment was made here, those were actions, not statements.
In many situations, telling the truth is a courageous act, right? It seems like it should be a basic expectation. But yeah, in many situations, it is a courageous act.
Could I just add something to that? Because it also takes courage to say to like mostly your workforce that we have no legitimate connection to this particular issue, whatever it is. Like we can't really impact it. The workforce itself is not united in its view. It's not germane to our customers. It's not germane to our business. And therefore, we're not going to wade into this issue. And that's not going to make some people happy.
Right.
We are staying out of it. And I think that's what CEOs also are finding, is that they also have the courage, or at least, the authenticity, that this is not something that concerns us. And therefore, we're really not going to get into it.
Are employees pressuring their companies to take a stand on things that are, in the CEO's mind, irrelevant to the business practices? Is that happening in companies?
Starting in 2019, we heard the number one reason why we feel compelled to speak out on issues is because of our employees and future employees. And they cite all those studies. Generationally, consumers, employees expect more from companies that they buy from and work for than making money. They want them to address issues. And so many CEOs pointed to that as a reason why they felt they need to. And they cited not special interest groups, not activist employees. And at the same time, they said, what are the boundaries of this? And this is a question from 2020 to this day. Like, what we can't weigh in on every issue because not every issue is relevant to our business.
Okay, I'm going to jump in and grab a few more questions. Couple media ones here. How does Substack impact today's media landscape and level and trust? Is that Is that an approach that might grow and be a solution as we move forward? Vivian, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I'll take it away specifically from Substack as the company, and basically the notion of individual brands, if you individuals as news brands, which has been it's not a new phenomenon. It's been around forever, but really in the last 10 years, it has become more and more prevalent for a whole bunch of reasons, including just, stemming from the whole rise of social media influencers, I think has sort of given license to individual journalists to be on their own. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I mean, some of the finest journalists out there are now solo operators. And they are, they're on Substack. There's a lot of other platforms as well, or they're part of these kind of like conglomerates like Puck and others, which are sort of not quite a company, but more like a collection of individuals. And they're able to, a handful of them make actually quite a lot of money. Some of them, make some money. And it's also related to podcasting, the boom in podcasting, which is also about individual voice. I think there's a question about like how many individual voices can be sustained in a very crowded environment. But yeah, I welcome it. I think I think it's a good development.
I actually think it's good for the journalists too, because they have I guess it gets back to the authenticity, a more direct relationship with their consumers and the readers. It's sort of like Reddit versus Twitter right now, I guess. So
my only caveat to it is that, the old adage, everybody needs an editor. Boy, do I see that coming to life. I read things, I'm like, this is good, but guess what? It would be a lot better if it were 40% shorter.
yeah, I'll vote for that. Here's a person who's like comparing reach. My friend went viral after Representative Nancy Mace cursed him out for asking about a town hall. I jumped in to help him with PR, got him on CNN yesterday with 500,000 views. Her bullying hate video, 30 million plus impressions. How do we keep up when social outpaces the biggest networks? I'm going back to you on this one, Vivian.
It's not great. I mean, look, people like, well, I'm not going to name names. Many politicians and other figures in the public eye, have they understand that outrageous behavior drives clicks. And so, we see that more and more from certain members of Congress, certain people in, media, not necessarily good faith media. And it's very successful. I mean, the platforms are optimized for it. So it's a match made in heaven. Can you reach that? Can you have that same kind of reach by countering these folks? I'm sorry, but for the average person who doesn't, it's like it's boring for somebody to say she was wrong than it is for, her or anybody out there to say outrageous things. So that's a tough one.
All right, a couple more questions. I just don't know which one to pick. We were talking about organizations or CEOs being authentic on issues. How can they ensure that accountability practices align with ethical standards and values? How do you ensure, is there a standard that an accountability that is transparent to consumers? Somebody says this is their value and we're practicing it. How do we know?
Yeah. So one is when CEOs talk about our values, they don't mean most of them don't mean ethics. They mean the behavior that they expect and need for the business to be successful given its strategy and its business model. And so I just want to make that point because often you hear the word corporate values and it sounds like trust and ethics. And yes, of course, but they consider that table stakes. The business must be in control. We can't have us come. But a lot of it is more like, I'll give you an example. Our business requires innovation. And therefore, we value people who are innovative, right? Or creative risk takers, et cetera, et cetera. The question there is, how do you ensure that you actually get that in a workforce of 500 people or 100,000 people? And part of that is communication, but most of that is wiring it into the systems that support that kind of behavior. So if you really wanted to interrogate, see, what is a company doing to ensure that it lives its values? I would go there. Show me your hiring criteria. Show me your compensation formulas. Show me your recognition programs. Show me who gets promoted. Show me what kind of stories do you tell? Who are the role models? What happens when some behavior manifests itself that's not consistent with that? And those are the elements of a
Or I can
cultural
see
system.
that. So
You actually have to see it, because if you don't see it in like hiring criteria, and you don't see it in compensation formula, and you don't see it in these other systems that support the behavior, then it's not likely that you're going to get the desired values to be lived. And so I think if you want to talk about accountability, I'd say that CEOs want that too. I mean, CEOs most of them don't want to just have the poster on the wall.
Right.
They want to see this behavior, and that doesn't just happen.
Okay. So we have 2 minutes left. I was going to give you the last word, but one of our questioners asks a good question that I'm going to give to you and then let you take it away from here. And that is, what would you say is the biggest takeaway you want us to gain from this conversation?
I'll give this a shot without having had much chance to think about it. But I think stay true to your ethical North Star. If you don't have an ethical North Star, find one. You can begin with the words behind Suki's head, and be brave. Do not let yourself. It's easy to be persuaded that, well, I'll just let this one go, or this thing, or maybe I won't say anything, or it doesn't matter. Resist that urge. And for particularly for students who are focusing on journalism, don't give up. We need you.
Beautiful. Jon?
Don't despair. I know we can't help but think that what we're living through now is unprecedented and it's never happened before. And in many respects, that's true. But the history of humanity is one of division, of fighting, of conflict, of disagreement, of attacking, of oppression, and all these kind of horrible things. We have our version of that. But the history also shows us that people are resilient, that institutions can persist with people behaving in ways that Vivian described, right? If they have the proper North Star, they're people who are people of integrity and character, then it's in their hands. It's in our hands, right? And I think history is not just repeating itself. You also get to repeat itself if you remember that these ultimately do happen. I mean, you don't, therefore, don't despair. Do your part.
Well, thank you. This has been truly inspirational, and I really appreciate your parting words. I really appreciate your time, Jon and Vivian. And to the folks who tuned in, thank you for being here. Thank you for asking questions. If you came in late, recording will be available later. Thanks to the Page Center, Aspen Institute. Signing off from here. Have a good day. Thank you all.
Thank you.